Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the content director at Word on Fire. Joining us is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, we're thrilled always to have you, so welcome.
Hey, Brandon, how you doing?
I'm doing wonderful.
You survived the hurricanes and everything.
Survived the hurricanes. I just got back from, we did all right. We did all right. No damage to the house, lots of debris and stuff, but certainly in light of the people in South Florida, Puerto Rico, Houston, so many people suffering through much worse. Listen, last week we weren't live in studio. Instead, we shared the talk that you gave at Facebook, and I promised all of our listeners that when you came back this week, you'd give them sort of a recounting of this visit to this extraordinary place, which you described as a millennial heaven. So tell us about the visit to Facebook, what you saw, what you heard, everything about it.
It was a delight. It was through the intervention of four great gentlemen up there in the San Jose Diocese who had followed my work, and they all were involved in different ways in Silicon Valley. And they said, could we arrange for something? Would you cooperate with that? So I said, sure, if you can arrange something. So God bless them, they did, and went up there with you and loved seeing Facebook. One of the most, when we think about it, one of the most remarkable places on the planet, a place that is linking the world together. I reflected a little bit on Teilhard de Chardin's idea of the noosphere. Maybe people today don't know that name, but he was very big, when I was going through seminary, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And one of his master ideas was that someday, as the evolutionary process went forward, we developed the noosphere. So from nous, meaning mind, there'd be this kind of great connection of all the minds of the world into one. And it all seemed kind of fantastic back in the 1940s and 50s when he was writing that. But you think in some ways the internet, and especially a thing like Facebook, it's almost like the realization of Teilhard's dream of the noosphere. One thing I felt at Facebook was really old, because I think I was by far the oldest person there. They're all people in their 20s and 30s. As you say, a millennial's paradise. If you gave a millennial all the money in the world and said, now build the world that you want, it would look like the Facebook headquarters. But they were very nice to me and very receptive. And heck, I was delighted to get the opportunity to speak there.
So we want to give another shout out to our good friend Bill, who spearheads the Catholic employees group there at Facebook, who was a gracious and hospitable host to us. So thanks,
Terrific,
Bill.
Yeah. And very bright guy and a very ardent Catholic. So I was delighted to meet him.
Well, listen, the focus of this episode, which is going to begin a two-part series, so this episode and the next one, is on Aquinas and the arguments for God. Now, the reason we're focusing on this is because there's been a recent video that's making the rounds online that deals with these arguments, and we actually watched it the night before your Facebook talk. I remember we were having dinner, we were talking about a book that you and I were both reading and enjoying by Dr. Edward Fazer called The Five Proofs of the Existence of God by Ignatius Press, and I mentioned this little video that had been making the rounds, and you watched it that night. And then I remember the next morning when we got together for breakfast, you said, this video was just bugging me all night long. Yeah. And we'll get into why here in a second. Now, we have a link to the video. It's titled Aquinas and the Cosmological Arguments. We have a link to it in the show notes for this episode of the Word on Fire show. But let me give you just a little bit of brief background before we start playing some segments of the video. It's put out by a YouTube channel called Crash Course. Crash Course was created and run by two brothers, John and Hank Green. Now, John Green is the uber best-selling author of the book Fault in Our Stars, which Bishop Barron has reviewed and done a video on. And his brother Hank also hosts some of these videos, especially the ones dealing with philosophy. It's funded by PBS, Squarespace, and other sponsors. And they put out these little short videos and courses, digestible 10 to 15 minute videos. Now get this, they have 6.5 million subscribers on their channel, and their videos collectively have 680 million views. So it's one of the most popular YouTube channels in the world. So one of the courses they've put out is called Crash Course Philosophy, has about 15 or 20 videos introducing people to philosophy. And one of those videos is titled Aquinas and the Cosmological Arguments. Now, this video already has 750,000 views. You'll get a sense of it as we play segments here, but it's fast paced, it's sort of fun and hipster, a little edgy and energetic. So it would especially appeal to a lot of young people. But they engage Aquinas and his arguments arguments in a way that I know Bishop Barron at least finds a bit dissatisfying. So let's dive in here. We're going to play a few segments. The video in total is about 10 minutes long. We're going to tackle the first 5 minutes during this episode, and then we'll tackle the next 5 minutes in the following episode. So we'll begin here by just playing the intro, and then we'll get Bishop Barron's thoughts. So here's the beginning of the video on Aquinas and the cosmological arguments.
Nothing gets people talking like proving the existence of God. Just look at the comments on our last video. And that is what Anselm of Canterbury did. He claimed in the 11th century to have come up with a deductive proof of God's existence through what we now know as the ontological argument. And if there was such a thing as a social network of medieval Christian philosophers back then, it was positively abuzz with the news for a long time. Because almost 200 years later, Italian theologian and philosopher Thomas Aquinas encountered Anselm's argument. But, like many others, he just didn't buy it. Aquinas did believe in God. It was just that, as a philosopher, he felt that it was important to have evidence for your beliefs. He knew that if he was going to dismiss Anselm's argument, he'd need to come up with something better. So he set out to construct 5 arguments that would prove God's existence once and for all. Yeah, 5. Apparently he was concerned that one wasn't going to do it, so he figured that out of 5, one was bound to stick.
Well, let's pause there, Bishop. I've heard this claim a lot. In Peter Kreeft's book, Handbook of Apologetics, he lists out 20 arguments for God. And many skeptics will say, man, if these arguments are so good, why does Aquinas need 5? Or why do you need 20? What would you say to that?
Well, because people are different. People have different backgrounds, different interests, different psychology. I think the good apologist should always have a kind of ad hoc approach, what will work in this particular circumstance. So you might try an argument, and for whatever reason, psychological, subjective, environmental, whatever reason, it doesn't grab a listener. All right, how about this one? Still doesn't work? How about this one? And you could, you who understand them fully can find them all pretty persuasive, but you realize they might not appeal to every type of mind or every type of psychology or personality. So to my mind, that doesn't tell for a second against the legitimacy of the arguments. It just means we're dealing not just with a purely abstract question, but we're dealing with tools now being used by an evangelist and an apologist. So that doesn't bother me one little bit.
Dr. Edward Fazer wrote a blog post not too long ago responding to this accusation that, well, why do you need 5 arguments if just one will do? And he made the point that look at the court of law. Any good prosecuting attorney will develop several lines of argument to establish the guilt of the accused. And no one would make the absurd suggestion that his account is somehow suspect because he has more than one argument. That's a flaw against him.
No, quite right. I would add something from John Henry Newman. So not just the psychological observation I was making, but Newman talks about the method by which we come to assent. And he said it's rarely by means of a single clinching demonstration, but rather by a whole series of probable arguments, intuitions, hunches, experiences, all of which converge on the same point. So part of the compelling power of the 5 arguments of Aquinas is they all come to the same conclusion. So starting from different starting points, they cohere around the same conclusion. And that in itself has a very convincing power for the mind.
Okay, so 5 arguments. It's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Let's keep going with this next clip.
His first 4 arguments are known together as the cosmological arguments, as they seek to prove God's existence through what he argued were necessary facts about the universe. So in keeping with the method that we discussed in our very first episode, we're going to examine these first 4 arguments of Thomas Aquinas and really try to understand them. And then we'll consider their merits and their weaknesses.
Okay, now that last sound, which we're going to come back to in a moment, is a sound of dominoes toppling. You'll see them in the video set up in front. We'll come back to that in a moment. It's important. But Bishop, let me ask you this. Let's just focus on these 4 first arguments of Aquinas. Where did these come from? Did Aquinas just invent these? Is he building on people before him? What's the background with these arguments?
Yeah, the latter is the case, that he was inheriting a lot of these arguments from the philosophical tradition. And if you look at the famous text in the first part of the Summa where he lays these out, it's almost though he's tossing them off. I don't mean that disrespectfully, but I mean he's writing a book for beginners, right? The Summa is written for incipientes, Thomas says, beginners in theology. And he says, more or less in a casual way, well, philosophers have proved the existence of God in these ways. And let me just kind of run through them for you. I think part of his assumption is that people had a general feel for these arguments. They kind of knew them. He would have inherited them from Aristotle largely, but also from Plato, also to some degree from the Augustinian tradition. They were in the air, you might say, philosophically and theologically. Thomas gives them, now I'll say this, a very pithy expression. Now, that's both good and bad. And see, I wonder if you had said to Thomas Aquinas, do you realize as you write this text, it's going to be carefully scrutinized for the next many centuries? Because, as I say, they're expressed in a very pithy, almost summary way. And that's good, typical of Thomas's mind. He had a mind that really cut to the essentials of things, right? But the downside is that they're often developed in a way that leave open a lot of questions. And things, there's a lot of background that needs to be clarified before we really understand the arguments. And what happens is people now, many centuries later, completely outside of Thomas's thought world and metaphysical context, look at these kind of sparely stated proofs, and they come to a lot of the wrong-headed conclusions that we're going to hear in this video. And to be fair to this fella, you know, he wasn't like the amazing atheist or some other idiot who's just kind of, you know, mouthing off. I think he was trying to be serious about these arguments. But the mistakes he falls into are very typical, even of, you know, I remember reading Bertrand Russell years ago as he's trying to counter these arguments with some of the most naive observations in the history of philosophy, in my judgment. But to some degree, I'll put the blame right at the feet of Aquinas, because he formulates them in such a pithy way that you can see many centuries later they're open to some misinterpretations.
So then would you say that these couple pages from the first part of the Summa, where he outlines these 5 arguments, that they shouldn't just be read in isolation as they are in many Philosophy 101 classes?
Absolutely. And it's, you know, a very similar thing, by the way, with Anselm's famous ontological argument, so-called, which is, I remember my thesis director in Paris, Michel Corbin, who loved Anselm, said, ni argument ni ontologique. It's neither an argument nor ontological. And his point there was we read it through the lens of Kant. And Kant gave us a reading of it in the 18th century that people now take as sort of axiomatic. But in fact, Kant was wildly misinterpreting it, in my view, and taking it completely out of its deeply mystical context. So that's a good example that we tend to, oh, there it is on one page in 3 simple steps. There's the so-called ontological argument. There's something similar on display in the way Aquinas is typically treated.
Let's move on here to the next clip.
Maybe the most striking thing about the cosmological arguments of Aquinas, at least to modern eyes, is that some of them are firmly based in the natural world. Even though he lived in a pretty unscientific time, Aquinas argued for the existence of God through his understanding of science, and with the help of what he thought was physical evidence.
Yeah. Is this an example of what you might call poisoning the well?
I mean, give me a break. Thomas begins, you might say, with the simplest, most obvious facts. So to play this kind of red herring science card is ridiculous. He begins, you don't need to be a scientist. You need to be a person with 2 eyes and a brain, you know, to begin where he begins with things like change, things like the fact of causality. In point of fact, Thomas Aquinas was taught by arguably the leading scientist of his time. Now, mind you, not scientists in the fully modern sense of the term and all that, but to say that Thomas was, you know, like pre-scientific in some crudely superstitious way is ridiculous. But also that's a red herring to play it in either direction as, you know, scientific or not. It's their arguments based upon the simplest observations of the material world, scientific or not. It's empirical observation, you know, that's backed up by a brain that thinks. That's how he starts. And so I wouldn't want to complicate this thing with these red herring abstractions about science. Just open your eyes and take a look. That's where Thomas is starting.
I think we've talked about this before in the past, that both Aquinas and Aristotle, on whom many of Aquinas' arguments are based, are sometimes dismissed by people because some of the examples they use in their arguments have since proved scientifically problematic. But this isn't a reason to dismiss the argument itself, right?
No, of course not. A very good example, you know, in the Summa Contra Gentiles, so which Thomas writes prior to the Summa Theologiae, he has a very developed version of the argument for motion. And it's drawing on Aristotle and so on, and it's very developed. However, he begins by saying, well, it's certain and evident to our senses that some things are in motion. For example, the sun. So of course you're a medieval person. Yeah, the most obvious thing in the world was the sun is moving around the earth. So sure, examples he uses, drawn from his own physics and so on. Sure, some of those are obviously false, but it doesn't matter. All they're doing is illustrating a metaphysical principle, and the metaphysical principle holds no matter what the passing science of the day happens to be. The key is to get to the principle and not get hung up on the example.
Okay, let's move to the next clip, which is where he finally starts to engage some of the actual arguments here.
For example, the first of his cosmological arguments is known as the argument from motion. In it, Aquinas observed that we currently live in a world in which things are moving, and he also observed that movement is caused by movers, things that cause motion. Aquinas was convinced that everything that's moving must have been set into motion by something else that was moving. By this logic, something must have started the motion in the first place. Otherwise, you'd be stuck in a philosophical quandary known as an infinite regress. You get an infinite regress when, in a chain of reasoning, the evidence for each point along the chain relies on the existence of something that came before it, which in turn relies on something even further back, and so on, with no starting point. Basically, Aquinas thought the very idea of infinite regress was absurd, logically impossible, because it implied that any given series of events began with nothing, or more accurately, never really began. Instead, it could have been going on forever. In the case of physical motion, Aquinas wanted to trace the cause of the movement he saw in the world all the way back to its beginning. And he figured there must have been a beginning. Otherwise, for him, it would be like watching these blocks fall and being told that nothing ever pushed over the first block. Instead, they had always been falling down forever, backward into eternity. There must have been a time when nothing was in motion, Aquinas thought, and there also must have been a static being that started the motion. And that being, according to Aquinas, is God, the unmoved mover. So, his argument from motion ran something like this. Objects are in motion. Everything in motion was put into motion by something else. There can't be an infinite regress of movers, so there must be a first mover, itself unmoved. And that is God.
All right, Bishop, you're shaking your head pretty much through that whole clip and banging your hands on the table here. There's several problems, but let's walk through them one at a time. I wanted to play a lengthy clip there so we weren't just sort of chunking him out of context. But that's his presentation of this first argument from motion. One of the things you mentioned when we first were talking about this video was his central misunderstanding of how these causal series work. And you said it's exhibited by these dominoes. You said when I first saw this video and saw a line of dominoes in front of him, I knew immediately that he misunderstood the argument. Talk about that.
Right. I mean, I didn't know a thing about these videos until you mentioned it. And you said, well, let's take a look at this. And so there I saw him in his little bow tie and his suit and his glasses. And he had in front of him a row of dominoes. And right away I said, okay, he's not understanding the Thomas arguments. See, if you have a row of dominoes, you're talking about a causal series that Thomas Aquinas would have described as subordinated paroxydons. Now, that's a technical term I'm using there. What it means is the chain of causality goes back in time. See? So back and back in time, and we trace the chain that way. But see, in that kind of causal series, the movement of the domino that we can see right in front of us is not here and now dependent upon the causal influence of every other domino along the line. Don't do dominoes now. Do parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, right? So my being here, in one way, of course, is dependent upon my father. But my father, God rest him, has been gone for 30 years, and I'm still here functioning and speaking and acting. I'm not here and now dependent upon the causal influence of my father. So that's a kind of causal series. Subordinated paroxydons, that means accidentally, incidentally. Thomas Aquinas, in fact, thought we could not prove on philosophical grounds alone that kind of causal series is not infinite. Thomas believed on biblical grounds the world had a beginning, but he didn't think you could prove it philosophically. None of the arguments appeals to that kind of historical paroxydon subordinated type of causal chain. But almost everybody who reads these proofs is misled into that perspective. You know what's really interesting about this, Brandon, is if Thomas Aquinas knew in the 13th century what we know today, namely that through the Big Bang, the whole universe did have a beginning in time, if you want to put it that way, that it's not eternal, he would have argued in a very different way. But he was so philosophically honest that he said, look, on philosophical grounds, I can't prove that kind of causal series is not infinite.
And to me, that's a strength, isn't it? Because it doesn't depend on whether the universe is finite in time or infinitely old. It's independent of those things.
So often in my conversations on the internet around these arguments, people will start making appeals to the universe. And I always say, look, bracket the universe. I'm not interested in the universe. Start with motion you can see right in front of you now. And with that very particular instance, we can get this proof off the ground. And now if I can, let me just make the distinction, because it might be a little confusing for people, that causal series going back in time, like dominoes or like fathers and grandfathers, that's accidentally subordinated. That kind of causal series, the present condition is not dependent upon here and now every other element. Okay, but let me make now a distinction. So you and I are talking to each other right now. I'm in front of this microphone, you're in front of a microphone, and we're talking, okay? So this is a change, it's a motion happening right now. To put it in Thomas's language, this is a transition from potency to act, or better, it's the actualization of a potential. Now, let me just say a quick word about that. It's very important to get this right, I think. So right now, I'm sitting in this chair in front of a microphone. I'm speaking to Brandon Vaught, who's in Florida. Okay. That's a potential which is here and now being actualized. I could be sitting on the floor. I could be up in my room. I could be going for a walk. You could be out for a walk. You could be flying through the air as you were yesterday, right? Those are all potentials that are not being actualized, but this one is being actualized. Now, since nothing can reduce itself from potency to act, there must be, now listen, everybody, not dominoes, there must be here and now some set of conditions that are actualizing this potential here and now. Now, let's just for fun do it more psychologically. Brandon, you're the scientist. You can help me with it, but do it psychologically. Why am I sitting here right now and not on the floor, not up in my room, not going for a walk? Well, because I want to do this podcast show. My desire to do this podcast show is here and now actualizing a potential, okay? Now, that desire, is that absolute, unconditioned, unmoved? No. That desire is ingredient in a larger desire, namely to propagate the work of Word on Fire. Okay, so that's moving the one desire, which is then moving my being here right now. What about that desire? Is that absolute, unchanged, unmoved? No, that's conditioned by a higher desire, which is desire to evangelize. Well, why do I want to evangelize? Well, because the Lord Jesus Christ said, go preach to all nations. Well, why do you listen to the Lord Jesus Christ? Well, I'm convinced the Lord Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Now, see what I'm doing here is I'm not doing dominoes going back into time. I'm analyzing the conditions for the possibility of the actualization of this particular potential here and now through a series of causes that are here and now dependent one upon the other. Does that make sense? In that kind of causal series, which Thomas called subordinated per se, that means through itself. In that kind of causal series, I can't go on indefinitely. Why? Because then I'm not explaining what's happening right now. This particular potentiality is being actualized here and now by a series of sets of conditions. They must be traced back, and here's the conclusion, to some reality, finally, that is utterly actualized, that is not itself conditioned by a further set of actualizing causes, that is, in fact, the unactualized actualizer. That's what Thomas is talking about. That's what he's talking about. And all the arguments are variations, if you want, on that theme. See, to get that is to get an awful lot of the obscurity out of this thing.
I found when talking with atheist or skeptical friends that this seems to be the central misunderstanding when it comes to these arguments. They dismiss the arguments because they don't think you can show that an infinite regress is impossible. And the reason why is because when they hear infinite regress, they think dominoes or something like that, rather than the scenarios you described. Another helpful one for me was Dr. Edward Fazer using the example of gears. He said, suppose you have 5 gears all connected together, and one of them turning gets the other 4 turning. As soon as that one stops turning, though, the other 4 immediately stop. So they're simultaneously being caused, not in time, not through an accidental series, but here and now they're being caused to turn. But that would be true whether you had 2 gears, 5 gears, or an infinite number of gears. You'd still need one gear that was turning them all here and now, getting them moving.
Otherwise, they're all instrumental causes, and an instrumental cause, by its very nature, can't produce something without a moving cause. So, in that sense, in that particular sense, that's why I heard a little bit of it in this fellow's video. It's an echo of Bertrand Russell, who said, "Oh, these poor medievals, they just couldn't think about infinite series." Give me a break. I mean, in fact, they think in an extremely sophisticated way about infinite series, and they accept the possibility, as I was just arguing, that there might be an infinite causal series. It's a very particular type of infinite causal series that Thomas rejects in these proofs. So it's got nothing to do with, the poor deers in the Middle Ages. They just didn't know how to think about infinite things. That's for the birds.
Let me ask you one more thing about this first argument. Interestingly, Thomas Aquinas describes it as the first and more manifest way of proving God's existence. What does that mean, and why do you think he said it?
Well, I just think it's just the most obvious thing. I mean, any child can see that things change. It's the most obvious thing to our senses. The other ones maybe require a little more metaphysical sophistication to grasp, but I think it's just the sheer evidence of change that makes it the first and most manifest. And it's clear throughout his career he thought this proof had a particular probative value.
Okay, let's move on to the next clip where our host, Hank Green, is going to be looking at argument number 2, the argument from causation.
Now, the second cosmological argument of Aquinas was a lot like his first one. Here he proposed the argument from causation, and it too sets out to avoid the problem of an infinite regress. But instead of it explaining the motion of objects, it set out to explain causes and effects in general all over the universe. The argument went along these lines. Some things are caused. Anything that's caused has to be caused by something else, since nothing causes itself. There can't be an infinite regress of causes, so there must have been a first causer, itself uncaused, and that is God. Just like with the argument for motion, the point here is pretty simple. Effects have causes. If you think about how you wound up watching this video, you can trace the line of causation back from moment to moment. If you think about it long enough, you can probably go pretty far back. But Aquinas said, again, it can't go back forever. There had to be a first thing that started off the chain of causes and effects, and that thing is God.
What I find interesting about that is he uses almost the same example you just used for the psychological thing, but instead of tracing the psychological causes sort of hierarchically in the here and now, he's doing it again temporally through time.
Same problem is he falls right, and he starts off okay, but then immediately falls into that typical trap of conflating a pair, say, subordinated causal series with a pair oxidants subordinated causal series. And once you make that move, it's like in one of my golf instruction manuals, if you make a certain move in golf, it's called a death move because you can't recover from it. And that kind of haunts my mind as a golfer. Like, oh, I just did it. Meaning, no matter what you do now, you cannot hit the ball effectively. So I would say that little move is a death move. Once you've made that, you're not going to get it. You're not going to get this argument right. Do it this way because it might help people. Because I know people somewhere they're spooked by the word cause, and there's a whole reason behind that. But something like conditions for the possibility of. Use that kind of language. So here's a state of affairs, right? That's one of a zillion possibilities. Like, why is this state of affairs? So I'm looking out my window right now. There's a car parked there. And is there anything necessary about that car being there? Absolutely not. It could be anywhere else. It could not be there at all. It could be up the street, down the street. It could be on fire. There's all kinds of possibilities. So naturally, I say, all right, I wonder why that car is there. What are the conditions for the possibility of that car being there? That's how you start. Now, when you discover what those conditions are, you naturally say, okay, is that sufficient? Or are they themselves conditioned by other factors? et cetera, right? Now, you're a scientist. You'll fill in the blanks. But I'll give you here kind of a stupid example. But right now, let's do it physically. Right now, I'm sitting in front of this microphone, right? There's a chair that's holding me up. I could be on the floor. I could be upstairs. I could be flying through the air. But right now, there's a chair. The condition for the possibility of my sitting before the microphone, one of them is this chair. Another one is the temperature of this room. Suppose that it was 1,000 degrees in here, right? Well, I'd be dead and the microphone would have melted, right? Suppose it was 1,000 degrees below zero. I'd be dead and the microphone would have splintered or something. So one of the conditions is, well, the temperature of the room. All right. You say, now what caused that? Now let's go to town. And we talk about high pressure and about winds and about the Pacific Ocean. And then let's keep pressing it. Talk about the jet stream. And talk about the sun, and talk about the solar system, and talk about conditions in the whole cosmos. See, I'm driving at is this particular thing of like, why am I here right now talking to you? What causes that? What makes it possible is a whole set, as you say correctly, of hierarchically arranged causal conditions. Can that go on indefinitely? No, says Aquinas, because then I haven't even begun to explain why I'm here, speaking to you on this microphone. There must be some, let's put it now, the first one is like unenergized energizer, some unactualized actualizer. How about some conditioning cause that itself is radically unconditioned? And there's our second argument. But don't play the domino or go back moment to moment. You're going to miss it. That's a death move.
Just to clarify one more time, when you say this can't go on infinitely, you don't mean it can't go on in time. You mean it can't go on in this hierarchical causal series.
Right. I can't just keep indefinitely searching for what's here and now, making a set of potentialities actual. I can't go on indefinitely searching for that.
Now, this particular video doesn't bring this up, but I know in the past that Thomas Aquinas' second argument here from causation is typically thought to have been refuted by the great skeptic David Hume. Can you talk a little bit about his criticism of the argument and how you'd respond to it?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Dietrich von Hildebrand that David Hume is by leaps and bounds the most overrated philosopher in the tradition. How many people appeal to David Hume? But when you actually look at David Hume's arguments, in my judgment, and Hildebrand's too, they're remarkably weak. Well, I'll just say, here's a quick thing I'll say about it. Oh, David Hume has dismissed the whole idea of causality because, Hume says you don't see causality, you see succession. You see event A, event B, B succeeds A, and then so by a kind of psychological hunch or intuition, we go, oh, A must have caused B. So there's Hume's, it's a kind of totally empiricist reductionism, as though it's simply a matter of observing states of affairs. But just follow this now. So there's no causality. It's just an illusion, a psychological trick of the mind. Well, along with these arguments for God's existence would go all of science, in my judgment. All of science relies upon the principle of sufficient reason, doesn't it? Or, if you want, the principle of causality. What set of conditions make possible things that we see in front of us? Any scientist of any stripe must be at every step of the way assuming that principle. So if David Hume is right and say, oh, there go the God arguments. Well, there goes biology. There goes chemistry. There goes physics, it seems to me. I mean, so you play the Hume card, be very careful. Now, we do a whole semester course on this, why Hume is wrong about causality. But, just take that point. Okay, fine, get rid of the God arguments, but get rid of all of science at the same time.
Well, listen, I think we'll stop here for this episode. We've played through about half of this viral video titled Aquinas and the Cosmological Arguments. A quick shout out to our friend Matt Fradd and his Pints with Aquinas podcast. That's where I first came across this video, and Matt has a great podcast episode where he sort of engages it. Also, I wanted to recommend to listeners, I know a lot of this is sort of difficult, dense philosophical waters. Bishop Barron has a great book that he wrote on Aquinas. It's titled Thomas Aquinas, Spiritual Master, and it covers, in part, some of the subtleties of each of these arguments in a very accessible way. So if you want to pick up that book, just go to wordonfireshow.com/Aquinas, and I think it'll provide a lot of illuminating insight to these topics. We also both recommend the work of Edward Fazer, particularly his 5 Proofs of the Existence of God, which is a new book that he just released with Ignatius Press. So if you're looking for a little more, check out those books. But then Stay tuned for next week's episode where we'll have the second half of our response to this video. Well, it's time now for a question from one of our listeners. Bishop, we have a question today from Stephen all the way down in New Zealand. So here's Stephen's question for you.
Hi, Stephen Woodnut from New Zealand. Just a quick question. I just want to know, Bishop, is death natural? This is a question that's kind of confused me a bit. So what would your thoughts be on, is death natural?
Yeah, good. It's a famously complex question. I'll make one quick little distinction. If you construe death in a purely kind of biological way, is death a natural part of life on planet Earth? Well, yeah, sure, in a purely biological way. But see, when we use the word death in a human context, we mean much more than that. We mean death as it's experienced, death as a source of great terror, death as something that we fear, death as this spiritually haunting reality. That is not natural. That's the fruit of sin, So I think I'd make that distinction. We want to avoid a sort of purely mythologizing approach whereby, human sin caused death. Well, then how do you explain the death of billions of creatures from the dinosaurs on before human beings were here? So I wouldn't want to play it that way, but death in the full sense of the term that includes all these negative psychological and spiritual realities, that is indeed the result of sin, and therefore it's not natural.
Well, thanks so much for listening to this high philosophical episode of the Word on Fire show. We're so glad to have you with us, and we invite you to tune in next week where we'll have the second half of our discussion about Thomas Aquinas and the arguments for God. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.